They left him to die. Deep in the Wyoming wilderness, an abandoned silo stood like a rusted tomb against the gray sky. Inside, trapped in the damp darkness, a massive pig struggled for each breath. His immense size seemed a cruel joke in the confined space, a mountain of muscle and will reduced to a prisoner in concrete and shadow. A single note, taped to a stiff piece of leather around his neck, fluttered with his labored movements. The words were a confession written in a trembling hand, an apology to no one. This wasn't just an animal abandoned. It was a soul shut away from the light. And the man who found him, a broken veteran named Jack Rohr, was about to discover that sometimes rescue works both ways. Late October had stripped Red Valley down to its bones. The sky wasn't blue, but a sheet of brittle gray pressed low by the coming winter. It was the kind of cold that didn't just chill the skin. It settled deep, a raw stillness that made every sound seem like an intrusion. The wind swept down from the high ridges, hissing through the bare branches of cottonwood trees, carrying the scent of pine sap and damp limestone from the creek bed. That creek was the only thing that seemed to know where it was going, a silver thread of water whispering over smooth stones, cutting through the silence of the valley. The land was vast and unforgiving. Red sandstone cliffs rose in the distance, their faces scarred by centuries of wind, standing like ancient, weary sentinels. There were no gentle curves here, only sharp edges and exposed rock. Ravens called to each other from the high perches, their coarse cries echoing across the emptiness, a sound as lonely as the landscape itself. The grass was brittle and brown, frost lingering in the shadows long past midday. This was a place that asked nothing of you and offered less. It was a mirror of endurance, reflecting a harsh truth back at anyone willing to look. It was the last place you went to find hope. It was the only place Jack Rohr had left. Jack moved through this landscape like another piece of the scenery, worn down and stripped bare. At 45, he carried his years like a heavy pack. His frame was still broad, the shoulders of a man built for carrying weight. But now they slumped ever so slightly, bowed by an invisible burden. He dressed for utility, not comfort. A canvas jacket frayed at the cuffs, jeans faded to the color of dust, boots scarred by countless miles. His face was a map of hard living, with sharp cheekbones and a jaw perpetually set tight. But it was his eyes that told the real story. A flat, clouded gray, they never quite settled, always scanning, always wary, as if expecting the world to fracture at any second. His home was a reflection of that internal ruin. An old ranch house built by his father now stood silent and stooped. The corrugated roof was patched with rust, the porch steps groaned underfoot, and the wind found its way through cracks in the wallboards. Inside, the air was cold and carried the smell of old wood and dust. There were no family photos on the walls, no radio playing in the kitchen. The only constant sound was the tired ticking of an old clock on the mantel, each second a heavy drop into the pool of silence. His days were a series of empty rituals. Wake at dawn, chop wood that didn't need chopping, walk the ridges until his legs ached. He was going through the motions of a life, the ghost of the man he used to be. The war had taken that man and never given him back. Afghanistan was a different kind of desert, but the feeling was the same, a vast, crushing emptiness. Jack had served multiple tours, his boots kicking up the dust of a country that seemed to resent every footprint. He'd seen ambushes erupt from silent villages, felt the searing heat of a rifle barrel in his hands, heard the deafening silence that follows close gunfire. But the desert didn't stay there. It followed him home, a fine grit in his soul that nothing could wash clean. At night, it claimed him completely. He'd jolt awake, shirt soaked with cold sweat, lungs burning for air he couldn't find. A slamming shutter became a gunshot. Rolling thunder transformed into incoming mortars. The crackle of the fireplace turned into the sound of rounds hitting stone. He slept with his back to the wall, a habit his body refused to break, even in the profound silence of Red Valley. The worst of it was Marcus Hale. Marcus had been more than a squad mate. He was the glue, the man who could find a joke in the dust and keep everyone moving forward. In one brutal ambush, in a canyon road swallowed by smoke and noise, Jack lost him. The memory played on a loop. Marcus shouting, the sudden collapse, the dust settling on a still form. The guilt was a chain Jack carried every day, a weight that whispered the same 3 words on repeat. If only, if only, if only. He'd walked away from everything after that. His marriage, his friends, any place that expected him to speak. He came to Red Valley because its silence was the only thing that matched the silence inside him. This morning was no different. The nightmare had been particularly vivid. The smell of cordite and dust clinging to him even after he'd opened his eyes. He rose in the half-light, pulling on his worn clothes, needing to move, to outwalk the ghosts. The path along the limestone creek was his usual route, a narrow scar of dirt his boots knew by heart. The air was sharp enough to hurt his lungs, the creek's whisper a constant soothing murmur against the ringing in his ears. He walked with his head down, watching his feet navigate the familiar roots and stones, trying to focus on the physical world, to anchor himself in the cold and the crunch of frost underfoot. But today, the rhythm was broken. As he rounded a bend where a deadfall crowded the trail, he stopped. Something was off. The air felt different, heavier, stale. Ahead, where the land opened up near the ruins of an old homestead he'd forgotten was there, stood a silo. It was a relic from a time when the valley had more farms, a cylindrical tower of concrete and rusted metal bands. Its door, a heavy slab of weathered wood, was slightly ajar. And from that black opening came a sound. Not the wind, not an animal calling. It was a low, ragged, rhythmic scrape, a sound of struggle, a sound that didn't belong. The hair on Jack's arms stood up. Caution was his first language now, a hard-learned dialect of survival. He approached the silo slowly, each step deliberate, his senses sharpening. The smell hit him first, damp rot, old grain, and beneath it, the thick, sweet-sour scent of a large animal in distress. The ragged breathing was louder now, echoing faintly in the concrete tube. He pushed the heavy door open wider, the hinges screaming in protest, letting a sliver of gray light cut into the darkness. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust. The silo was mostly empty, just a scattering of moldy straw and dirt on the concrete floor. And then he saw it. A massive shape, a mountain of dark flesh and bristle, wedged against the far curve of the wall. A pig, but unlike any he'd ever seen. It was colossal, easily several 100 pounds of solid muscle with broad shoulders and a powerful frame. But its size was a trap. A heavy chain, thick and scaly with rust, was wrapped multiple times around its chest and foreleg, tethering it to a rusted iron ring cemented into the wall. The animal's skin was raw where the chain bit into it, dried blood and fresh sores marking a cruel necklace. Its head was down, its whole body shuddering with the effort of each breath. It was a creature of immense strength, utterly broken by confinement. Jack's throat tightened. The wrongness of it was a physical blow. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. His eyes, scanning the pitiful scene, caught a flicker of white against the dark hide. Taped to a stiff, cracked leather strap around the pig's thick neck was a folded piece of paper. He stepped closer, his boots silent on the gritty floor. The animal was too exhausted to even lift its head, its flanks heaving. Jack reached out, his fingers surprisingly steady, and carefully peeled the tape back. The paper was damp at the edges. The handwriting rushed and slanted, as if written in a storm of emotion. He lifted it to the faint light from the doorway and read the few sparse lines. His name is Titan. Too stubborn. Too much trouble. Forgive me. The last two words were scratched into the paper, the pen nearly digging through. Forgive me. Jack knew those words. He'd whispered them into the dark himself, a nightly prayer to a ghost who couldn't answer. This wasn't just a note. It was an echo of his own deepest regret. He looked from the words to the suffering animal, and the chain that connected them felt less like iron and more like shared pain. Jack's knife was in his hand before he'd made the conscious decision to draw it. The worn wooden handle felt familiar, a cold comfort against his palm. His initials, J.R., were carved deep into the grain, the R nearly smoothed away by years of sweat and grit. He approached the pig, Titan, slowly, his movements deliberate, his palms open and visible. The animal's eye, a small, dark pool of exhaustion, tracked him. There was no fight left in that gaze, only a deep, weary acceptance that was somehow worse than fear. He braced one hand against a loop of the cold, rusted chain where it lay across the pig's massive shoulder, feeling the grim vibration of each labored breath through the metal. He turned the blade sideways, seeking a gap between links. The first screech of steel on steel was a match strike in the quiet gloom. It flared into a memory instantly. The shriek of ricochets off canyon stone, the metallic taste of fear, the world narrowing to a tunnel of noise and dust. Jack flinched, his vision swimming for a second, the silo walls doubling before snapping back into focus. He pulled a breath deep into his lungs, the air thick with the smell of panic and rust, and put his weight on the knife. The first link surrendered with a tired clack, the sound absurdly loud in the confined space. He worked methodically, easing the chain away from the raw, weeping skin beneath. His movements were those of a man disarming a trap, every sense hyper-aware. Titan's breathing hitched, his thick skin twitching, but he didn't struggle. He endured. It was the stillness of a creature that has learned the futility of resistance. Jack moved to the next rap, the knife squealing again against the stubborn iron. This time the sound became the scream of a blown truck axle, a prelude to an ambush he knew all too well. The silo vanished, replaced by a hot, dusty road. Sand stung his eyes. Marcus was at his shoulder, his mouth moving, words lost in the static and roar. A ridge exploded ahead. Jack's hand jumped. The blade skittered off a link and nicked the pig's hide. A thin line of red welled up instantly against the dark bristle. He jerked his arm back as if burned. "I'm sorry," he rasped. The sound of his own voice, rough and unused, startled him. Titan's ear flicked toward the sound. He didn't flinch. He just blinked. One slow, heavy lowering of a lid, like a door being gently closed. In that breath, Jack saw Marcus's grin, heard the ghost of a voice that always knew how to steady him. "Don't stop, Jack." Not a judgment, just a thing he would have said. Jack set his jaw, the phantom grit of desert sand between his teeth. "I won't stop," he whispered, to the pig, to the ghost, to himself. Not this time. He wiped the blade clean on his jeans and went back to the chain. The final wrap was the worst. It was cinched high around the chest, right behind the forelegs, where the metal had dug in deepest and the flesh had swollen tight around it, swallowing the links. There was no gap to work with. Jack had to force the blunt spine of his knife into the space, prying metal against inflamed skin. Titan shuddered, a full-body tremor that spoke of immense pain. The sound of the link finally breaking wasn't loud. It was a dull, metallic sigh, but it felt like something uncoupling deep inside Jack's own chest. The chain went slack in his hands. For a long second, nothing changed. The massive pig remained exactly as he was, frozen in the posture of captivity, as if the chains were still there, imprinted on his muscle memory. Then a great, shuddering wave moved through his entire body. His legs, held taut for who knows how long, buckled. He didn't collapse so much as settle, his immense weight sinking into the damp straw and dirt with a heavy, final-sounding whump that sent a cloud of dust motes dancing in the sliver of light. Jack was moving before the dust settled. He dropped to one knee, his hands going under the pig's broad, solid jaw, cradling the heavy head. The bristles were coarse against his palms, the skin beneath warm and alive. He turned the head gently, keeping the snout clear of the dirt, making sure those weary eyes could still see the world, and not just the ground. Titan's breathing was fast and shallow now, panting, each exhale hitching at the end. The smell was intense up close. Blood, fear, and the undeniable, earthy scent of the animal itself. "Easy," Jack murmured, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. "Easy there." He shrugged out of his canvas jacket, wadded it into a rough pillow, and slid it under Titan's jaw. His fingers, stripped raw from working the knife, stung as he gently felt along the grotesque wounds at the base of the neck. He didn't probe. He just worked back, carefully untangling the coarse hair matted with dirt and dried blood. Anything to prevent more pulling when the animal tried to rise. His palm came to rest on the leather strap, the note still tucked beneath it. His name is Titan. The name fit. It spoke of strength, of immovable weight. Jack leaned down close, his face near the pig's ear. "You're free now, Titan," he said. The words surprised him by how sure they sounded, how they carried a conviction he hadn't felt in years. His voice was still rough, weathered by disuse and the cold air, but it held. "You're not going to carry it alone anymore." He didn't know if he meant the physical chain or the weight of abandonment. He didn't know if the pig understood anything but tone. He only knew that the massive head settled a fraction heavier into his cupped hands, a gesture of trust as profound as any he'd ever known. The walk back to the ranch was a slow, painful pilgrimage. Jack moved with a deliberate slowness he hadn't known he possessed, each step measured against Titan's labored breathing. The massive pig followed, not out of trained obedience, but from a sheer exhaustion that left no energy for resistance. His head hung low, snout nearly, brushing the frozen ground, and every few steps his legs would tremble violently, threatening to buckle. The raw wounds on his neck and chest stood out angrily against his dark hide. Jack kept one hand on the lead rope, the other always ready, hovering near the pig's shoulder, a steadying presence that spoke more than words ever could. The sky began to bleed from gray to a deeper charcoal, the afternoon light failing fast. The wind picked up, cutting through Jack's thin shirt, but he barely felt it. His entire world had narrowed to the rhythm of their progress, the crunch of his boots, the dragging shuffle of Titan's hooves, the ragged pull of air into tired lungs. He spoke low and steady, a continuous murmur meant to soothe them both. "Just a bit farther. That's it. One step. Good. Another." The words were anchors in the growing dark. When the ranch finally came into view, the relief was a physical ache. The truck, an old Ford, sat where he'd left it behind the shed, a relic from his father's time. Its bed was a mess of old tools and rust flakes. Jack cleared it out with frantic energy, throwing aside a broken shovel and a coil of rotten rope. He found some warped planks in the weeds and nailed together a crude ramp, his hands shaking with cold and urgency. Getting Titan up, it was the real battle. The pig balked at the hollow sound his hooves made on the wood, eyes showing white around the edges. Jack didn't pull. He just stood at the top of the ramp, waiting, his voice a low constant. "It's all right. I'm not putting you back in chains. Just this. Then we rest." It took 10 long minutes of patient standing before Titan took the first step, then another, his immense weight making the whole truck groan in protest as he settled in the bed. The 3-hour drive to Cheyenne was a special kind of torture. Every bump in the dirt road sent a jolt through the truck frame, and Jack would flinch, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. Titan stood braced in the back, legs splayed, his whole body trembling with the effort to remain upright. His breathing was a ragged, whirring sound, even over the engine's rumble. Jack's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He wasn't just driving a sick animal to a vet. He was carrying a fragile, hard-won trust down a highway of pain, and every pothole felt like a betrayal. The veterinary clinic in Cheyenne was a small, red-roofed building that looked out of place against the vast Wyoming plains. The gravel of the parking lot crunched loudly under the truck's tires as Jack pulled in and killed the engine. The sudden silence was broken only by Titan's strained panting. The clinic door opened with a soft chime, and a woman stepped out. Dr. Claire Hanlon was tall and spare, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a loose knot. Wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose, and her gaze, sharp and intelligent, swept from Jack's weary face to the massive, suffering animal in his truck. "Oh, bed." "Good Lord," she whispered, the words a puff of steam in the cold air. She was already pulling on a pair of exam gloves as she strode forward. "Who could do this to a creature?" Her voice was clinical, but beneath the professionalism was a current of pure fury. Jack just shook his head, his throat too tight to form words. He simply nodded toward the pig, all the explanation he was capable of. "Bring him around back," she instructed, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. "I need light and space." Jack obeyed, guiding Titan down the ramp with infinite care. The pig's steps were even more unsteady on the flat, packed dirt of the yard. Dr. Hanlon circled him slowly, her hands moving with practiced efficiency over his body, pressing, probing, feeling. She spoke aloud, her voice a low monologue of diagnosis. "Large black, I'd guess. Maybe 3, 4 years old. Severe malnutrition, ribs and hips prominent. Dehydration. These lacerations. Deep, infected. Signs of old scarring here on the flank, possibly from crowding or abuse. Joints are stiff, likely from prolonged immobility." She pressed a stethoscope to his side, listening intently. "Heart's strong, though. Lungs sound clear despite the strain. Remarkable." She straightened up, peeling off her gloves, and looked at Jack, her expression softening from assessment to something like respect. "You brought him just in time. He's been to hell and back, but the will is still there. The core is still good. He wants to live." Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He stared at Titan, at the way the pig now stood a little taller, as if sensing the shift in the air, the presence of help. His own voice was rough when he found it. "Then we fight for him." Dr. Hanlon gave a single, firm nod. "Then we fight." The back door of the clinic chimed again. A girl, maybe 10 years old, emerged holding a small wire cage containing a trembling white rabbit. A woman, her mother, followed close behind, her face drawn with concern. The girl, Sophie, had her hair in 2 long, pale braids and wore a knitted sweater that seemed too thin for the cold. Her eyes, a wide and startling blue, went immediately to the colossal pig standing in the yard. She froze, her grip tightening on the rabbit cage. "Mama," she breathed, her voice full of awe. "Look at the pig. He's enormous." "Stay back, Sophie," her mother said quickly, a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "He could be dangerous." But Sophie was already taking a hesitant step forward, then another. drawn by a curiosity that outweighed her fear. The rabbit shifted nervously in its cage. Jack opened his mouth, a warning on his lips. But the words died there. Titan stirred. The great black head lifted, ears swiveling toward the small girl. His nostrils flared, sampling her scent. Jack braced for a reaction, for the panic or aggression he'd been primed to expect. Instead, Titan did something that stole the breath from everyone present. He lowered. His head, slow and deliberate, a gesture of profound gentleness. A warm puff of air rolled from his muzzle, curling around Sophie's outstretched hand. The yard went utterly still. Sophie froze, her eyes wide. Then, with a reverence that belied her age, she set the rabbit cage down in the dirt and slowly extended her fingers. They brushed against the coarse, tangled bristles of Titan's forehead. The massive pig stood immobile, his eyes half-lidded, as if soothed by the feather-light touch. A sound escaped him, not a grunt, but a deep, rumbling sigh of contentment. Dr. Hanlon watched, her professional mask slipping into something like wonder. "Seems he knows kindness when he feels it," she said, her voice soft. Sophie giggled, a bright, clear sound in the tense air, and stroked him again. "He's not scary, Mama," she declared, her voice full of certainty. "He's sad." Jack stared, his throat dry and tight. The stories, the warnings, the label of too much trouble, all of it shattered against the simple, undeniable truth of a giant bowing to a child's hand. The thought formed, clear and sharp in his mind, a truth he felt in his bones. Maybe you're not lost after all. The drive back to Red Valley was slower, the old Ford seeming to understand the preciousness of its cargo. Titan lay on a fresh bed of straw in the truck bed, sedated and bandaged, his breathing a deep, steady rhythm instead of a ragged fight. The clinic smell of antiseptic still clung to them both, a sharp contrast to the cold, clean scent of the coming night. Jack navigated the familiar dirt roads with a new kind of care, each bump and dip met with a wince, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. The massive, sleeping form was a responsibility that settled over him not as a weight, but as a purpose. He wasn't just driving home. He was transporting a fragile piece he'd helped create. The barn greeted them with its usual chorus of groans and sighs. Jack had spent what was left of the daylight preparing it, shoveling out old debris, laying down a thick layer of the cleanest straw he could find. He'd patched the worst of the holes in the walls with scrap wood, a temporary measure against the biting wind. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was dry. It was more than a concrete silo. Getting the still drowsy Titan from the truck and settled was a task that left Jack sweating in the cold air, his muscles burning with the strain of guiding the pig's immense weight. Finally, the animal lay on his side in the deep straw, his bandaged neck stark white against his dark hide, his breathing even and deep. Jack filled a bucket with fresh, cold water from the well and set it nearby. He sat on an upturned crate for a long time, just watching the steady rise and fall of the pig's flank, listening to the sound of life being lived, not just endured. Later, in the cabin, the silence felt different. The tick of the clock was still there. The wind still whispered through the cracks. But the emptiness had been displaced. He lit a match, coaxed a small flame to life in the fireplace, and the light that flickered against the walls felt less like it was fighting the dark and more like it was holding a space within it. He lay on his narrow bed, the warm blanket pulled up to his chin, and for the first time in memory, he didn't feel entirely swallowed by the house's loneliness. His body ached with a clean physical fatigue, the kind that usually promised sleep. But the night had its own plans. The dream came as it always did, a thief in the dark. The heat of the desert, the taste of dust, the world narrowing to the crack of rifle fire and the concussive thump of mortars. Marcus was there, his mouth shaping words lost to the chaos, then the sudden sickening collapse. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Jack had ever heard. He woke as he always did, jolting upright, a scream trapped in his raw throat, his shirt plastered to his skin with cold sweat. The room swam, the shadows in the corners twisting into familiar shapes of terror. He was back there. He was always back there. And then, cutting through the phantom roar in his ears, came another sound. From across the yard, through the cold stillness, a low, guttural grunt. Then another, followed by the soft, shuffling sound of heavy weight shifting in straw. It was a sound of presence, of another being awake in the world. Jack froze, listening, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sounds from the barn didn't stop. They were calm, mundane, anchored in the present. A creature breathing, moving, existing. Not a memory, not a ghost. Real. He clung to the sound, using it as a rope to pull himself out of the quicksand of the past. His breathing began to slow, to match the slower, steady rhythm from outside. The details of the room sharpened into focus. The rough wool of the blanket, the chill air on his face, the faint orange glow of embers in the fireplace. He was here, in Red Valley, and he wasn't the only one awake. The realization was a small, steady light in the overwhelming dark. He didn't go back to sleep. He just sat there, wrapped in the blanket, and listened to the night. Shared. The next night, the storm inside him broke with a violence that left no room for quiet listening. It was a perfect, cloudless night, the sky a black bowl pierced by 1,000,000 cold, sharp stars. The air was so still he could hear the creek whispering a half-mile away. And that was the problem. The silence was too complete. It was the kind of deep quiet that had always felt like the moment before an ambush, the breath held before the world exploded. He'd been on edge all evening, a tight coil of tension that every familiar creak of the house only wound tighter. It started with a pop from the fireplace, a log settling in the flames. To Jack, in that heightened state, it was the unmistakable crack of a sniper's rifle. The world dissolved. 1 second, he was staring into the fire. The next he was on his feet, back against the wall, chest heaving. The desert sand was in his mouth, the heat on his skin. Marcus was shouting, his voice choked with dust. The urge to run, to find cover, to return fire, was a physical pain. He stumbled out onto the porch, gasping for air that wouldn't come, his hands clawing at his own throat. The vast starry Wyoming night yawned before him, but he saw only the narrow confines of a canyon closing in. He was drowning on dry land. His legs gave out. He crumpled to his knees on the frozen gravel, the impact jarring his teeth. The sobs came then, ugly and raw, torn from a place so deep he thought they might break him apart. They were for Marcus, for the men who never came home, for the years spent in the silent prison of his own making. Words spilled out, fractured and desperate, apologies to a ghost. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I should have. I wasn't fast enough." The grief was a tidal wave, and after years of holding it back, the dam had shattered. From the barn, a sound answered. Not a grunt this time, but a loud, sharp cry. A worried, questioning call that cut through the night. Then the solid thud of a heavy body hitting the inside of the barn door. Again and again, a steady, rhythmic pounding against the wood. Jack heard it through the storm in his head. The sound was an anchor, a lifeline thrown into his personal hell. He clung to it, dragging himself toward it on his hands and knees, gravel biting into his palms. He reached the fence that enclosed the small barnyard, his whole body shaking with the force of his breakdown. He fumbled with the gate latch, his fingers numb and clumsy, and stumbled through. Titan was there, standing at the fence line, his ears pricked forward, his dark eyes fixed on Jack. He wasn't panicked. He was alert, present. Jack fell against the rough wooden rails, his strength gone. He reached through the slats, his fingers tangling in the coarse, stiff bristles of the pig's neck. The contact was electric, a solid, warm, living thing. He pressed his forehead against the cool wood, his body racked with sobs, and poured out a decade of grief to the only witness who wouldn't flinch from it. "They left you," he choked out, the words mixing with tears. "And I left him. I walked away and he fell, and I just kept walking." The confession, spoken aloud to the cold night air and this silent animal, was the most honest thing he'd said in years. Titan stood immovable. He didn't shy away from the noise or the emotion. He shifted his great weight and leaned his solid flank against the fence where Jack clung. The pressure was steadying, grounding. The pig's warmth radiated through the wood, a tangible reality against the cold horror of the memory. Jack cried until he had nothing left, his tears drying on his face, his breathing gradually slowing to match the deep, calm rhythm of the animal beside him. The silence that returned wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. It was peaceful. He had fallen apart, and a creature the world called trouble had held the pieces together. The morning frost was still thick on the grass when the crunch of boots on the trail announced a visitor. Jack, splitting wood by the shed, froze, the axe halfway through its arc. He wasn't used to company. He watched as Thomas Delgado rounded the bend, an older man with a rancher's worn posture and a face creased by a lifetime of squinting into the sun. In his hands was a woven basket, a checkered cloth covering its contents. The scent of warm cornbread reached Jack before Thomas did. "Morning, Jack," Thomas said, his voice carrying the soft, rounded vowels of his native Spanish, smoothed by decades in Wyoming. Jack lowered the axe, nodding slowly. "Morning. You're up early." "Old bones don't sleep long," Thomas replied with a faint smile. He placed the basket on the porch railing. "Brought you some of my wife's bread. Still warm." The simple gesture tightened Jack's throat. He wasn't used to kindness. It felt like a language he'd forgotten. "Thank you," he managed, gesturing toward the door. "Coffee's on." Inside, the cabin felt different with someone else in it. Thomas sat at the table, removing his hat and setting it down with care. His eyes, dark and knowing, wandered to the window that looked out on the barnyard. Titan was there, rooting lazily in a patch of thawing earth, his bandages a stark reminder of the recent past. Thomas watched him for a long, silent moment, his gaze thoughtful. "That pig," he said finally, turning back to Jack. "He did not choose you by accident." Jack paused, the coffee pot hovering over a second mug. "What do you mean?" Tomas leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his expression earnest. "Animals like that one, they have old souls. They carry their history in their bones. They do not give their trust. It is earned, or it is given as a gift. You do not find them. They find you." He nodded toward the window. "If he stands beside you, it is because he has seen something in you, something worth staying for." Jack set the pot down, the truth of the words settling deep into him. A quiet validation of the bond he felt but couldn't name. Tomas wasn't just talking about a pig. He was talking about recognition, about two broken things recognizing the strength still left in each other. "He chose you, Jack," Thomas said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "Never forget that." Jack could only nod, the coffee forgotten, his gaze drawn back to the window, where Titan, as if sensing he was the topic of conversation, lifted his head and looked right at the house. The silence after Thomas left was different. It wasn't the empty silence Jack was used to, but a thoughtful one, filled with the old man's words. He chose you. Jack stood at the window, watching Titan nuzzle at the cold ground. The pig's sheer size should have been intimidating, a reminder of the power that could easily break a man. But all Jack saw was the careful way he moved, the gentleness in his eyes when he'd lowered his head to that little girl. The chain scars around his neck were a map of pain, but they weren't who he was. Night fell, and with it came a different kind of quiet. A deep, cloudless cold settled over Red Valley, the kind that made every sound seem like a crack in the world. Jack felt it first as a tightening in his chest, a familiar dread coiling in his gut. He tried to outrun it with chores, banking the fire, checking the locks, but the stillness was a predator waiting to pounce. It was the pop of a single ember in the fireplace that broke him. In the absolute quiet, it wasn't a log settling. It was a muzzle flash in a dark canyon. The world flipped inside out. One moment he was staring at the flames. The next, he was on his feet, back slamming against the cabin wall. The heat wasn't from the fire. It was Afghan sun baking his neck. The smell wasn't pine smoke. It was cordite and dust. His lungs seized, refusing to pull air. Marcus was there, his mouth moving, shouting words that were swallowed by the roar in Jack's ears. The need to move, to fight, to find cover was a physical agony. He stumbled out onto the porch, gasping, his hands clawing at his own throat as if tearing away invisible hands. The star-filled Wyoming sky was a vast, mocking emptiness. He was drowning on dry land. His legs gave out. He crashed to his knees on the frozen gravel. The pain, a distant shock. The sobs came then, not cries, but raw, tearing sounds ripped from a place he'd boarded up years ago. They were for Marcus, for the silence that followed the ambush, for the years of whispering apologies to a ghost in the dark. "I'm sorry. Marcus, I'm sorry. I should have been faster. I wasn't enough." The words were a flood, each one a piece of the dam breaking apart. From the barn, an answer. Not a gentle grunt, but a sharp, alarmed cry. A sound of concern that cut through the phantom gunfire. Then a solid, deliberate thud against the inside of the barn door. Again and again, a rhythmic grounding pound against the wood. The sound was a lifeline. Jack clung to it, crawling on hands and knees across the sharp gravel toward the fence. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers numb and stupid, and fell through the gate into the barnyard. Titan was there, waiting at the fence line, his ears pitched forward, his dark eyes fixed on Jack. He wasn't panicked. He was present, solid, real. Jack fell against the rough wooden rails, his strength gone. He reached through the slats, his fingers tangling in the coarse, stiff bristles of the pig's neck. The contact was a jolt of reality. He pressed his forehead against the cool wood, his body shaking, and poured out a decade of grief to the only witness who wouldn't look away. "They left. You," he choked out, the words raw. "And I left him. I walked away and he fell. And I just kept walking." The confession, spoken into the night air against the warm hide of this animal, was the truest thing he'd said in years. Titan didn't move. He didn't shy from the noise or the emotion. He simply shifted his immense weight and leaned his solid flank against the fence where Jack clung. The pressure was immense, steadying, a wall against the storm. His warmth bled through the wood, a tangible anchor in the cold horror of memory. Jack cried until he was hollow, until the sobs subsided into shaky breaths that slowly fell into rhythm with the pig's own deep, calm respirations. The silence that returned to the yard wasn't empty. It was shared. He had shattered, and a creature the world had abandoned had held the pieces together. The morning after the breakdown was clear and brittle, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. The air held the sharp, clean scent of frost and earth, the world feeling scrubbed raw. Jack moved with a purpose that was new, a quiet resolution settled deep in his bones. The previous night's raw vulnerability hadn't left him weakened. It had carved out a hollow space, and into that space had flowed a strange, steady calm. He knew what he had to do. It was a ritual, a line drawn in the dirt between the past and whatever came next. He didn't saddle anything, didn't bring tools for work. Instead, he led Titan by a simple rope halter back along the familiar trail to the limestone creek. The massive pig walked beside him with a surprising steadiness, his wounds healing, his strength returning day by day under Jack's constant care. His presence was a solid, warm weight at Jack's side, a silent companion in the morning chill. The creek was just as he remembered it, the water whispering its constant, soothing song over smooth stones. And there it was, the leaning cottonwood tree, its bark still scarred by the ugly, deep groove where the chain had bitten deep. The earth at its base was damp and dark. From his pocket, Jack withdrew a small glass jar. Inside it, carefully folded, was the note. He unscrewed the lid, the metal cold against his fingers, and pulled out the scrap of paper. He didn't need to read it again. The words were etched into his memory. His name is Titan. Too stubborn. Too much trouble. Forgive me. The confession, the abandonment, the desperate plea for absolution. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of its sorrow, then placed it back in the jar and sealed it tight. This wasn't about preserving the memory. It was about putting it to rest. He knelt at the base of the scarred tree, the cold of the earth seeping through the knees of his jeans. Using his hands, he dug a small, deep hole right where the chain had lain. The soil was cool and yielding. He placed the jar inside, a tiny coffin for a great pain, and covered it over, pressing the dirt down firmly with the flat of his palm. It was done. The words were buried. The apology was returned to the earth. Then he rose and drew his old army knife from his belt. The handle was worn smooth, familiar. He found a clear patch of bark on the tree just above the scar, and began to carve. The sound of the blade biting into the wood was clean and sharp, a sound of making rather than destroying. He carved slowly, deliberately, each letter a promise. When he was finished, he stepped back. The words stood out against the pale wood, stark and simple. Titan is home now. He looked at the pig standing patiently beside him. Titan's dark eyes seemed to take in the carving, the tree, the man. He sniffed the freshly turned earth once, then let out a soft, deep grunt, a sound of acknowledgement. It felt like a ceremony, a marker laid down. The past was buried. The future was here, standing on 4 solid feet, breathing the cold morning air. Jack laid a hand on the pig's broad, sturdy shoulder, feeling the life thrumming beneath the bristly hide. He had given Titan a physical home in his barn, and in return, Titan had given him a home inside his own skin again. The sound reached them before the children did, the clatter of bicycle tires on gravel, the bright, unrestrained energy of young voices cutting through the valley silence. Jack looked up from the creek bank. A group of teenagers, 5 or 6 of them, erupted onto the trail from around a bend. Their scarves and jackets splashes of color against the muted autumn landscape. They skidded to a halt, their laughter dying abruptly as their eyes landed on the scene before them. Their gaze swept from Jack to the colossal black pig standing calmly at his side. A collective intake of breath was audible. One boy, bold and loud just moments before, spoke in a hushed tone. "Whoa! Look at the size of him!" A girl in a bright purple scarf dismounted her bike, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. She took a hesitant step toward the creek bank, then stopped, her eyes seeking Jack's permission. "Mister," she called across the water, her voice small against the vastness of the land, Can we pet him?" Jack's first instinct was a hard no. It was a reflex born of protection, for them and for the fragile trust he'd built with Titan. His body tensed, his gaze flicking to the pig, assessing for any sign of unease. But Titan just stood there, his ears twitching with curiosity, his great head turned toward the children. There was no tension in his powerful frame, no warning in his dark eyes, only a calm, patient watchfulness. The memory of Sophie at the clinic, of Titan bowing his head, surfaced in Jack's mind. He looked back at the girl, at the hopeful, nervous faces of her friends, and gave a short, sharp nod. "All right," he said, his voice carrying easily over the water. "But easy, one at a time." The group crossed the creek carefully, picking their way over the slippery stones. Their voices now dropped to reverent whispers. The first boy, the bold one, approached first, his hand outstretched but trembling slightly. Titan didn't move. He lowered his head, just as he had for Sophie, and allowed the boy's tentative fingers to brush against the coarse bristles of his neck. The boy gasped, then a nervous laugh escaped him, his eyes shining with disbelief and thrill. "He's so solid," he breathed. The girl in the purple scarf was next. Her touch was gentler, more confident. She stroked his tangled mane, her small hand disappearing in the mass of coarse hair. "You're beautiful," she whispered, as if sharing a secret just between them. Titan closed his eyes halfway, a deep rumbling sigh of contentment vibrating through his chest. One by one, the children took their turn, their initial fear melting away into pure, unadulterated awe. They didn't see a monster, or a problem, or a dangerous beast. They saw majesty. They saw gentleness hidden in immense strength. Jack watched, something loosening in his own chest with each child's touch. This was the creature deemed too much trouble, abandoned to die alone in the dark. And here he stood, receiving these clumsy, heartfelt affections with a patience and grace that shamed every judgment ever passed on him. The children's laughter returned, softer now, filled with wonder instead of rambunction. When they finally pulled away, waving and chattering as they remounted their bikes, the valley seemed to absorb their joy, holding on to the echo of it. Jack stood with Titan by the creek, the pig's quiet presence a warm constant beside him. He realized, with a clarity that felt like a physical warmth spreading through him, that the lessons he needed weren't about forgetting the past. They were right here, in the steady, patient heart of a pig who had every reason to fear the world, but had chosen instead to trust it. And in that trust, Jack began to remember how to live. The change came swiftly, a sudden violence in the atmosphere. All afternoon, the sky had been restless, a simmering pot about to boil over. The clouds gathered like dark, bruised thoughts on the horizon, and the air grew heavy, thick with a tense energy. By late evening, the first low rumble of thunder rolled across the valley, not like a warning, but like a promise of chaos. Then the lightning came, not gentle forks, but savage, white-hot spears that stabbed down at the dry ridges above Red Valley. One struck the rocky slope with a crack that seemed to split the world in two. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then a plume of orange flame burst upward, greedy and immediate, devouring the tinder dry grass. The wind, which had been still, suddenly awoke with a vengeance, howling down from the heights and fanning the sparks into a raging, moving wall of fire. It gathered its terrible strength and began its race downward, toward the valley floor, toward the town, toward Jack's ranch. The valley, transformed into a scene from a nightmare. The air thickened with smoke, acrid and choking, burning the eyes and lungs. The red glow of the flames painted the cliffs in hellish light, and the roar was a living thing, a cacophony of snapping cedar, exploding pine sap, and the relentless crackle of consumption. From nearby pastures, the terrified bellows of cattle and the frantic barking of dogs added a layer of panic to the inferno symphony. A woman's scream ripped through the chaos from somewhere down the road, a sound of pure, undiluted terror. People scrambled, a disorganized frenzy of desperation. Buckets, wagons, shovels, anything that could carry water was seized. But the fire was a predator, and it was faster. It jumped gullies, consumed fences in seconds, and sent embers dancing ahead on the wind like malicious fairies, starting new blazes wherever they landed. The night itself seemed to be breathing fire, and the once familiar landscape of Red Valley became the antechamber of an unforgiving hell. Jack tried to move, to react, to fight, but the sound pinned him in place. The popping, snapping, booming of the fire was a trigger buried deep in his psyche. It wasn't just wood burning. It was the staccato crack of rifle fire, the hollow thunder of mortars landing too close. The acrid smoke wasn't from pine. It was cordite, choking and thick. The world dissolved. The heat on his face was Afghan sun. The roaring in his ears was the ambush in the canyon. The shouts of men, the deafening silence after the explosion. He was back there, his chest locked, his lungs refusing to draw breath. His hands shook violently at his sides, useless. He could see the fire racing toward his corral, could hear his own livestock screaming in panic as they crushed against the fencing, trapped. But his body was trapped too, a soldier frozen on a battlefield he'd left years ago, utterly helpless against the ghosts that held him captive. The scream that shattered his paralysis was not human. It was a pig's cry, shrill, defiant, and powerful enough to cut through the fire's roar and the phantom gunfire in Jack's skull. Titan. From the relative safety of the barnyard, the massive pig had seen the advancing wall of flame, had smelled the terror on the wind. He pounded the hard-packed earth with a front hoof, striking sparks from the dirt, his massive chest heaving. His eyes reflected the advancing inferno, but there was no fear in them, only a fierce, determined light. Then he moved. He didn't retreat. He turned and bolted toward the source of the panicked cries. The corral where Jack's few head of cattle and old horses were trapped, their eyes rolling white with terror. Titan drove himself forward, a black titan charging into the smoke and heat. He didn't flinch. Lowering his head, he aimed his powerful shoulder at the weakest point of the old wooden fence. The first impact shook the posts. The second hit with the force of a battering ram. With a splintering, explosive crash, the fence shattered. The animals didn't hesitate. A surge of liberated panic, they stampeded through the broken opening, fleeing toward the lower fields, where the fire had not yet reached. On the ridge, where townsfolk were gathering in horrified clusters, they saw it. The people who had whispered about the cursed pig, the dangerous beast, stood in stunned silence as the very animal they had condemned became a savior. He moved through the chaos not as a monster, but as a force of deliverance. But the fire was relentless. It rolled onward, swallowing the corral, licking at the edges of the barn, and surging into Jack's yard. The cabin walls groaned under the intense heat. Smoke poured in thick black waves, filling Jack's lungs, searing his throat. He stumbled forward blindly, choking, his eyes streaming tears. He was seconds from collapsing, from being claimed by the smoke or the flames. The battlefield had him. He was going to fall. That was when the dark shape materialized through the hellish gloom. Titan burst back into the yard, his hide smudged with soot, his nostrils flaring. He skidded to a halt directly in front of the choking, disoriented man. For one eternal heartbeat, man and beast locked eyes through the swirling wall of smoke and memory. Then the pig lunged, not to attack, but to connect. He struck Jack's chest with the solid, blunt force of his head. The impact was physical, real, and brutal. It knocked Jack backward, the jolt tearing him from the grip of his paralysis. He hit the ground, gasping, coughing violently, his body screaming for air. He tried to rise, but his legs were water, his vision swimming. And then Titan did the unbelievable. The massive pig bent his front legs, folding his great body down to the ground beside Jack. He pressed his solid, warm flank against Jack's chest and side. Some ancient, desperate instinct took over. Blind, choking, his mind fogged with smoke and panic, Jack's hands clawed at the pig's coarse, soot-stained bristles. He grabbed 2 great handfuls of mane, and with the last of his strength, dragged himself up onto the pig's broad, strong back. The moment Jack's weight settled, Titan surged to his feet. He wheeled around, turning his back on the advancing inferno, and charged. He did not run like a prey animal in blind terror. He ran with purpose, a powerful, determined gallop that carried them through the choking, blinding dark. Embers fell around them like burning rain. Jack clung desperately, his face buried against Titan's neck, his fists locked in the bristly mane. The pig's muscles bunched and released beneath him in a rhythm that was nothing short of miraculous, steady, powerful, life-saving. Each stride carried them farther from the heart of the fire, away from the canyon in Jack's mind, toward clean air. When they finally burst free of the worst smoke, the cool night air hit Jack's face like a blessing. He sucked it into his burning lungs, sobbing with the shock of it. The stars were still there, overhead, untouched. Titan slowed, his own sides heaving like great bellows, his breath coming in hot, steaming clouds. They had reached the open meadow. The fire still raged behind them, but here, for now, was safety. On the ridge, the gathered people had witnessed it all. They had seen the pig shatter the corral. And now they saw him emerge from the very jaws of the inferno, a man clinging to his back. A collective cry went up, a mix of awe and disbelief. Lord Almighty, the beast! He carried him out. The murmurs spread like the fire itself had moments before. The words monster, cursed, dangerous. They died on their lips, replaced by a stunned, reverent silence. The image was etched into their minds forever. A colossal black pig, scorched and mighty, emerging from hell itself as a savior. Jack slid shakily from Titan's back, his legs buckling, dropping him to his knees in the cool grass. Titan stood over him, sides lathered, chest pumping, but his head was high. Their eyes met in the flickering, orange-hazed light. Jack reached up a trembling hand and pressed his palm against the pig's solid jaw. "They said you were trouble," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken from smoke and emotion. It wasn't an accusation. It was a confession of his own blindness. "But you saved them. You saved me." Titan exhaled hard, a burst of steam in the cold air, and lowered his head until his broad forehead pressed, just for a moment, against Jack's shoulder. It was an answer. In that moment, the world shifted irrevocably. Titan was no longer the abandoned brute. He was a guardian, a brother. And Jack understood, with a clarity that felt like truth itself, that their lives were now fused at the point where death and survival meet. The valley would never see either of them the same way again. The valley held its breath in the days that followed, the air thick with the scent of charred earth and a strange, collective exhaustion. The fire had passed, but it had taken its toll. Blackened hillsides smoldered like dying campfires. Fences lay as twisted skeletons in the ash. The land itself seemed wounded, and the people moved through it with a quiet, grim purpose, sifting through the wreckage. rebuilding what could be salvaged, mourning what was lost. Jack moved among them, his own repairs going deeper than posts and wire. Something had been burned out of him in that inferno, some final wall of isolation, and in its place stood a quiet, steady light. One evening, as the cicadas tentatively resumed their song, and the last traces of smoke ghosted from the ridges, Jack sat at his old pine table. A single oil lamp threw shifting shadows across the wood. In front of him lay a battered notebook, open to a blank page, and a pen that felt unfamiliar in his calloused hand. It had been years since he'd written to anyone, years since he'd dared to reach across the distances that war and grief had carved between him and the men who had once been his brothers. The Harper crew. Some were gone. Some had vanished into their own silent valleys. A few he knew were still out there, buried under the same weight he'd carried for so long. He dipped the pen and began, the words coming haltingly at first, then with a growing certainty. "Brothers, I don't know where this letter will find you. Maybe you've stopped checking mailboxes altogether. I almost did. But I thought you should hear this." He wrote of the silo, the chains, the note asking for forgiveness. He wrote of the nights haunted by Afghanistan and Marcus, and the profound silence that had been his only companion. And he wrote of the fire, of the paralyzing fear, and of the massive pig who would charge through the flames to carry him out. For the first time since the desert, he wrote, the pen scratching firmly, "I feel like I'm not trapped anymore. The nightmares still come, but I'm not alone when they do. Titan stands with me. He breathes, and somehow I remember to breathe too." He paused at the bottom, the pen hovering. He thought of the men scattered across the country, each in their own private hell, convinced there was no way back, no door out of the silence. He finished the thought. "If you think you can't return, remember this. Sometimes what saves us isn't another soldier or a mission or even a doctor. Sometimes it's something you never expect. For me, it was a pig. For you, it might be something else. Don't shut the door if it comes." He signed his name, folded the letter, and slid it into an envelope. The act of reaching out, of casting this small message into the world, felt like a victory in itself. A week later, he found himself guiding the truck north, Titan standing tall and calm in the trailer behind him. The sign on the weathered fence read, "Veterans and Swine Initiative." He'd heard about the program, a quiet idea that men and animals could heal the broken parts in each other. He wasn't sure he believed in programs, but after the fire, he knew he couldn't keep this quiet miracle to himself. The ranch was wide open, dotted with pens where veterans in worn jeans worked alongside handlers, their movements slow and patient. The air smelled of hay, dust, and a cautious hope. Some men laughed as they brushed a sow's back. Others stood silent, their eyes holding that distant look Jack knew all too well. When he stepped out of the truck, heads turned. Titan followed, his soot-darkened hide and immense size drawing low murmurs of recognition. Even here, his reputation had preceded him. The program coordinator, a woman with a sun-faded ball cap and eyes that missed nothing, came forward. Her gaze swept over the pig, then up to Jack. "That the one they call Titan?" Jack gave a quiet nod. "He's with me." Her eyes softened with curiosity. "Well then, let's see what he's here to do." That afternoon, the group gathered in a wide training ring. Jack stood near the fence with Titan, watching as trainers demonstrated groundwork with nervous rescued pigs. His eyes scanned the veterans until they landed on a young man sitting apart on a fence rail, arms locked tight across his chest. Marine short hair, a lean frame, but his eyes were hollow, empty. A man who'd come because he had nowhere else to go, not because he believed anything could fix what was broken inside. Jack learned his name from a whisper. Luke Jensen, 3 tours. Silence hung on him like a second skin. For most of the session, Luke didn't move. He didn't participate. He just sat, jaw clenched, staring at the dirt, waiting for it all to be over. And then, without a signal or a word from Jack, Titan moved. He stepped away from the fence, his hooves sinking into the dust with quiet purpose. The veterans nearby stilled. Trainers turned, alarm flickering in their eyes. But Titan didn't charge or show aggression. He walked. Step by deliberate step, he closed the distance across the ring until he stood before Luke. The young Marine stiffened, panic flashing in his eyes as the massive head lowered toward him. His hand twitched on the rail, ready to shove the animal away. But Titan only breathed, a long, steady, warm exhale that curled around Luke's trembling fingers. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Luke's hand lifted, slow as a rising moon, and came to rest on the pig's broad muzzle. His fingers shook violently. Titan stood like a stone, eyes half-lidded, accepting the touch. Luke's lips parted. A whisper escaped, so quiet it was almost stolen by the wind. But everyone close enough heard it. "I think I can breathe again." The ring fell into a profound silence. No one dared to break it, not with what was unfolding before them. Jack stood rooted to the spot, his own chest tight, feeling the sting of tears he wouldn't let fall. Titan had carried him through fire, but this was different. This was the pig seeing a crack in another soul and gently, wordlessly, letting the light in. He didn't move. He only watched. Word of what happened spread through the program faster than the Wyoming wind. By the next week, veterans who had once eyed Titan with wary suspicion now approached him with a quiet reverence. They didn't need explanations. They had seen the way Luke Jensen's shoulders lost their permanent hunch, the way the hollows in his eyes seemed a little less deep. Soon others came. Men who hadn't spoken in months found themselves sitting in the straw beside him, their silence companionable, not lonely. Women who woke screaming found that leaning against his solid, breathing side made the night less terrifying. The great black pig stood for them all, a silent, steadfast sanctuary. Jack watched it all with a sense of awe. This animal, once condemned as too much trouble, was quietly, gently writing new stories without saying a word. One of the program's psychologists pulled him aside one afternoon, her voice hushed. "Do you know what you've brought here?" she asked. "Sometimes it takes us years to help someone trust enough to open up, to accept a hand. That pig of yours, he does it in minutes." Jack swallowed hard, his hand resting on the railing as he watched Titan standing calmly in a ring of quiet men. "He chose us," Jack said, his voice low. "Same way he chose me." Weeks bled into a new rhythm. The hills began to show tentative green shoots beneath the ash. The sky stretched wide and forgiving once more. Jack returned to Red Valley with Titan, carrying not just his own healing, but the quiet weight of the healing they had sparked in others. One night, under a sky the fire had washed clean, Jack walked into the open field behind his cabin. The stars were a brilliant, countless river above. Titan grazed nearby, his dark form a solid island in the silvered grass. A cool breeze whispered through the valley, carrying the scent of damp earth and renewal. Jack stepped closer and laid a hand on the pig's thick, sturdy neck. For once, his chest was utterly still. No sand, no ghosts, no fire. Only a silence that felt like peace. He pulled out his weathered journal, thumbed to a blank page, and wrote a few simple lines, the words as sure and solid as the ground beneath his feet. They called him Trouble. I call him Brother. He chose me as I chose him. He closed the book and tucked it away. Ahead, the lantern light from his cabin glowed softly. He turned for one last look at Titan, who lifted his head, ears flicking, his dark eyes steady in the starlight. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Jack Rohr believed in tomorrow. And on the ground, stretching long across the red earth of the valley they had saved, and that had saved them in return, their two shadows lay side by side. The valley began its slow mend. The blackened hillsides, once raw and smoking, gradually softened under the late autumn rains, the first green shoots of ryegrass daring to push through the ash. The air lost its acrid sting, replaced by the clean, wet scent of damp earth and pine. People still moved with a weary purpose, mending fences and rebuilding sheds, but the frantic panic had subsided into a steady communal rhythm of recovery. Jack worked alongside them, his hands blistered from hauling charred timber, his back aching from digging new post holes. But the work felt different now. It wasn't just a chore to fill the silence. It was a contribution. The isolation that had once been his armor had been burned away in the fire, leaving behind a raw but connected sense of belonging. One evening, the cabin quiet, except for the soft hiss of the lamp, he sat at the old pine table with his battered notebook. The blank page seemed less an accusation and more an invitation. He thought of the men from his old squad, the Harper crew, scattered across the country like leaves in a storm, each trapped in their own private silence. He uncapped the pen, the motion feeling both foreign and familiar. "Brothers," he wrote, the ink dark against the pale paper, "I don't know if this will find you, or if you'll even open it. I was that man for a long time. But something happened here." His pen moved with a new certainty, tracing the story of the silo, the chains, the note that echoed his own guilt. He wrote of the long nights and the shared silence with Titan, and then of the fire, the paralyzing fear that rooted him to that spot, and the unbelievable charge through the flames. For the first time since the desert, he scrawled, the words flowing now, "The ground feels solid under my feet. The ghosts are still there, but they don't own the room anymore. This pig," he breathes, "and it reminds me to do the same." He paused, thinking of Luke Jensen at the Veterans Program, of the hollow look that had finally, briefly filled with light. He finished the thought, a message cast into the void for any of them who might be listening. They told me he was too much trouble. They were wrong. Sometimes the thing that saves you looks nothing like what you expect. Don't shut the door if it comes. He signed his name, folded the letter, and sealed it in an envelope. The act felt like throwing a lifeline, not knowing if anyone was there to catch it, but throwing it all the same.